Welcome everyone to our session for the Torrance Festival of Ideas, and we're so happy to have you joining us, or if you're joining us later for the recording, we're happy to have you here. And it is my honor and complete pleasure that I get to introduce our speaker, Dr. Denis Dumas. But first, I'm Kelsey Forrester. I am a current doctoral student for with the Educational Psychology program in Applied Cognition and Development, and I also have the privilege of being the College of Education's librarian, so two roles. And so I get to know Denis in two different ways, which is wonderful. And I just going to give a little bit of a background about Denis. Dr. Dumas is Associate Professor of Educational Psychology here at UGA, and he's situated within the program for gifted and creative education, as well as our quantitative methodology program. His work is broadly focused on creativity and education, but there's an emphasis placed on creativity assessment, of which you've created numerous measurements for, as well as cognitive processes of creative experts and instructional supports for students is creative thinking. And today he'll be taking a bit of a theoretical approach and lens on our discussion of development of creativity. But I also believe, Denis, you wanted to share a little bit of your AI work first, and then we'll jump over into more of your talk. So I will stop talking and I send it over to you. Thanks so much for joining us. It's all yours.
Hey, everybody. I'm keeping the participant list up so I can see who's here. So because I can't see any faces. So maybe I'll do really well just talking at my own reflection. Well, it's really an honor to follow you, Maciek, as well. Your lab does such amazing work, and we've talked about it a lot, about how much of an inspiration. Oh, hello. How are you? What an inspiration your work is to me. So I'm so happy to get to follow you. When Maciek showed some of the drawing stuff, I thought maybe I'll do a little bit of a quick pivot and show some drawing stuff too before I do my regularly scheduled talk. For those of you who know a little about me, or if you don't, one of the things that I do a lot of is create measures and assessments for creativity. And actually, just this week, my group had our first school district. I just sent them the score report yesterday. Our first school district used our assessments for high stakes identification. And so we're really feeling really proud of the way we've been able to make an impact in schools already. That was all with a verbal assessment, actually, and that was some of the data that Maciek mentioned. But I also wanted to show a little bit about what we're doing with drawing just before I segue into maybe a little bit of a more theoretical account. Actually, I think I'm going to let my dog out of the house. I'll give you just 1 second. This is my porch in beautiful Athens, Georgia, by the way. For those of you who haven't gotten to visit, Athens is amazing, and it's just the perfect weather. I am going to share my screen. So even though I can't hear anybody, I'm sharing my screen, I know that you can hear me. This is very similar to what the Karwowski lab did in their study in the science museums in Warsaw, which is so unbelievable and so impressive. Our group also has an AI-based automatic scoring system. Their group used Audra, which is a little bit of an older system, just a year or two old. But we have our own AI that actually is under review right now in JCB. But it's also available open source through our website. So if you have a browser, you can actually access this AI. If you haven't ever seen this website before, openscoring.du, which is Denver University.edu, we have AI for verbal measures. I can't actually show it to you right now, though, because we went semi-viral and got just totally inundated with responses this week. I'm not exactly sure how it happened. Evidently, we were featured on a website, like a coder's website, for just cool stuff you can do, and a gazillion people found it, and just it wasn't really spam, but it was just too much to handle, and our servers crashed. So we can't do that right now. We got to get that back up and running. But we do have the drawing up and running. So similar to the to what Maciek was showing, It uses the base drawings from the MCTI from Baptiste Barbeau in Belgium. And you can select different ones that you might want. Like these are all basically different abstract shapes that can start a person thinking about it. It forms a constraint so that we have a good sense of how to score it. And what I tried to do essentially is draw some decent, some bad, and some really good scores. Ruth, I saw on the chat with Maciek, you were worried about the AI value and conformity. At least for now, it's not trained to do that. It's trained on tens of thousands of previous drawings, and what it's looking for is a drawing that's different from those drawings, like a drawing that's original or unusual, that sort of surprises it. So you just click on the little drawing tool. You can make it bigger and smaller, the weight of the brush. And then you can just kind of doodle around. Like, let's say you wanted to make it a big smiley face and this is its nose or something. Maybe I give it eyebrows. I don't know. That's not particularly good, but I'll just hit submit. And it processes. It takes a second, but it will do it right in front of you. And then you can get scores, percentile ranks actually for your drawing. Let's see if it works. Hopefully I'm not embarrassed about how bad this idea is. Or maybe the thing's already fallen down. Oh, here we go. So it places you along the distribution of everything else it's ever seen. Here I actually got into the 41st percentile for originality, which is pretty good for me. Here's some other tabs of things that I did. You guys can all see this, by the way. I'm just kind of feeling self-conscious. Kelsey, can they see me? I just want to make sure.
Yeah, we can see you.
Oh, perfect. Well, here's
Yeah.
another tab. Just a little tiny smiley face got me only into the 15th percentile because that's very common, very easy to draw. The AI has seen this a million times. And then I drew a little ghost with the same starting point, got me into the 66th percentile. So that was a little bit better, more in the middle. Probably not still getting me into any kind of specialty program for the creatively gifted, but nonetheless, I took a little bit more time, Maciek, while you were speaking, and I was doodling while you were speaking, and I drew this one, which is supposed to be me in my garden looking at flowers. So you can see my long hair, my big nose, and I'm kind of leaning over the pot to look at the flowers. And that actually got me into the 98th percentile. So I'm not sure if you agree with those ratings. We're going to continue to try to make these AI systems better. But if anybody wants to play around with it, I put the link in the chat during Maciek's talk, and I hope that you will. But wanted to make you aware of that before I go. To segue into the theoretical talk, one of the reasons why, I'm just going to stop sharing for a second. One of the reasons why I think these AI feedback models, like our group is now fond of saying like a Duolingo for creativity, automatic feedback, automatic improvement, practice effects, that kind of thing. One of the reasons why I think they're so important for kids or just novice learners in a domain of any age is because they invite the learner to start thinking not only about what they think is original or what they haven't seen before, and it invites them to start thinking about what another person would find original, or in this case, what an AI model would find original. An AI model that's seen everything that everybody's drawn in this science museum or in this school. If you had that kind of memory and you had really seen 1,000 children's drawings, well, what would be new? And that kind of theory of mind, that thoughtfulness about what would another person find original, I find that to be a really important jump and step in it. Let me see, Bonnie. I think maybe I should wait and go through. Bonnie, the elaboration can have a slight effect. I don't know if any of my drawings would be considered high quality. I can send the link at the end. But the idea is that it's actually not scored for quality. It's meant to be scored for the originality of the response. It's true that a child needs to they need to mark the page enough in order to become highly original. There is a slight elaboration effect. Like Maciek said, it's hard to fool, but there is some. It also happens with verbal tasks too, right? If you only write one word on a verbal task, it's hard to be highly original. But if you write 5 or 6 or 7, you can use some modifier words and you can show that your idea is different from others. So elaboration does tend to correlate positively with originality. I'm not sure if that's a problem. Maybe you find it to be, but I actually don't. But we could definitely talk about that more. That would be fun. So just to get back a little bit to what I was meant to talk about, maybe I'm creatively jumping around, or maybe you think not so creatively. I'm going to share my PowerPoint. And as long as you're seeing the right view, this is what I wanted to speak about. How, as we develop creativity in a domain, we move from a self-referenced form of creativity to a socially referenced form of creativity. And I actually think the AI models can help with this so much as the AI is another person, and maybe a more knowledgeable other, even to use a Vygotskian term. So that's where I'm headed. Let me see how to hit next here. So, and I think everybody was talking about this to a certain extent over the course of the festival. I've been able to go to most of the talks. There's this ongoing conundrum in creativity science, or at least I see it as a conundrum, where creativity is so multifaceted in its manifestations, so ubiquitous in a way that it challenges us as a field to really decide whether these are actually instances of the same phenomenon. Let's see what I wanted to say to you. Right? Creativity is this sort of fundamental, nearly ubiquitous and universal part of being human. I remember at the Division 10 conference in Denton 2 months ago, Paul Sylvia was saying it's so amazing how high the base rates are for creativity. Almost everybody has some creative activity that they enjoy. Creativity is nearly universal in terms of the human experience. It can be very domain general, right? We give these tasks to kids. They're not really tied to any particular domain of learning. There's sort of a general disposition or problem solving style that's associated with openness, playfulness, is certainly not associated necessarily with expertise. I think about domain general creativity as being essentially like a child centric construct, similar to how it means something when we give a child a domain general problem solving task rather than nesting in a domain. In creativity, we can give these domain general tasks to kids, and it tells us something about what will they do when they're asked to come up with responses to a divergent thinking task, even though it's not in any domain. Here's a list of attributes that might affect it: playfulness, openness, flexibility, originality, imagination. This is what I think of as this like sort of first type of creativity that we study. On the other hand, though, creativity is also rare, effortful, risky. It's an aspect of expertise. It's something that we don't necessarily think that everybody achieves fully, even over the course of their life. It can be highly domain specific, associated with accomplished or even eminent individuals. And words like that, what I would associate with this form of creativity might be invention, innovation, paradigm shifting, a renaissance or a revolution. So you can see, at least I see it as sort of a conundrum or an antinomy here, where we have this seemingly paradoxical relationship between creativity as a ubiquitous, universal, fundamental, domain general, childlike, playful capacity, and on the other hand, creativity as rare, effortful, paradigm shifting, revolution inspiring, invention creating. I suppose that's a good verb for creativity. And to me, it's hard to study this construct creativity until we really talk about, well, at least which one of these two are we thinking about? Clearly, when we do the measurement with kids, we're really thinking about the first mostly, I'd say, but later on, it definitely becomes the latter. So how and why and when? These are the kinds of questions that my lab is trying to delve into. Let's continue the conundrum for a second, right? If creativity can be so different across individuals and context, how can we unify our field and make progress? I think it's not particularly easy. The folks who study children's creativity don't necessarily cite the folks who study eminent expert level creativity. The folks who study domain general creativity don't necessarily read and cite those who are studying creativity in a very specific domain. Can our findings actually influence each other? Maybe it's not just that we don't read each other or we don't talk to each other. Maybe it's actually that our findings can't talk to each other, or there's something getting in the way. Maybe a finding about like Maciek just showed, one of our findings was that this domain general creative ability as measured on verbal divergent thinking tasks correlated pretty strongly with achievement in elementary school. But can that be helpful in understanding how that latent potential might actually eventually feed in to the domain specific creativity of experts? We do have some longitudinal studies specifically from Paul Torrance, but we don't have too much evidence about how that sort of raw domain general ability could feed in to adult expertise. I think this is particularly salient when we talk about creativity in education, because if we're going to get people from A to B, if we're going to take a highly creative in terms of high divergent thinking capacity, either high drawing or high verbal, high originality fourth grader, and we're going to actually put them on a pathway to become innovative, inventive, paradigm shifting, revolution sparking, these types of a more adult, domain specific, expert level creative, if we're actually going to put them on that path, how would it change? How does it go from one to the other? So basically everyone has been talking about this during the festival, of course, but formal education definitely influences creativity. It's got to. But is that influence positive, negative, something else? Elisa Kuipers was saying how there's an argument that schools kill creativity, right? Right. In that way, maybe schooling is bad, or at least it's suboptimal for creativity. But on the other hand, it doesn't take a lot of sleuthing going into the historiometric data. Not, of course, maybe it does take a lot of sleuthing, but it doesn't take a lot of sleuthing to read the papers about the historiometric data. That professional or eminent creators in essentially any domain almost always have formal training that supported their development. Dean Keyes-Simonton has made the argument that poets are the least likely to have formal training. And as you move away from that domain, you get more and more likely to have formal training. But even eminent poets almost always have had some kind of mentorship or some kind of apprenticeship in the domain where they're actually being trained. So how do we reconcile these issues in order to become an expert in the domain who's capable of making a creative contribution, something that I would call a creative expert? In order to become someone like that, you have to get trained. You have to go to school. But if schooling is bad for creativity, well, I don't know. Where should I send you? Is it about having the right opportunities in school where you sort of don't get squashed? This is where my theorizing has been leading me, these types of questions. Right. So what's the deal? This is what Past Me a week ago wrote when he wrote these slides. That's what he wanted to say. So my goal here is to conceptualize how creativity might change over the course of academic development. And by academic development, I don't mean like physical or a neurocognitive development. Academic development begins when the learner begins their acclimation in the domain. So if you've never learned something at all before and you start learning it, that's when your academic development in that area starts. And I want to use that conceptualization to make hypotheses about how creative activities about which creative activities might benefit learners at different stages. Like if a learner has this much expertise or this much knowledge, what kinds of activities might I be able to do to help them along? Of course, I want to eventually use that conceptualization to build into intervention studies. But at this point, I'm talking about hypotheses and conceptualization here with you. My main tool that I did for this paper, and by the way, the paper that I'm mainly talking about, I did with my two colleagues, Boris Forthman at the University of Münster in Germany, who many of you probably know, and also Patricia Alexander at the University of Maryland. And we used a model or a theory that's been active in EdPsych for a long time called the model of domain learning. And the model of domain learning describes specific ways that knowledge, interest, like motivation, and strategy use in terms of the deployment of procedural knowledge, that's what strategy use is, how those things change as students progress through 3 different stages of academic development. First, acclimation, and then competence, and then eventually to expertise. Pat Alexander first posited this theory in the mid-90s, and it's been tested and theoretically discussed since. But it was the first time, at least for this particular theory, that creativity was incorporated. And I felt the time was right for that cross-pollination between the creativity literature and the more typical core EdPsych literature, bringing creativity into one of their main theories. Just to do a little bit of an overview of the MDL before I get too much further, I know I've got a little bit of time to do it. In the beginning of domain learning, when you first start in a domain, you're acclimating. And at this stage, learners possess little and disorganized domain knowledge. Of course they do, right? Because they're new. They don't know the things that an expert would know. Because of their small amount and the disorganization of their knowledge, the less and the more central aspects in terms of the importance to the domain, they're difficult to distinguish. So if you recall at one point when you were an acclimating learner, or maybe if you're an acclimating learner now, you might rely on a mentor or an educator to help you know, is this a part of the domain that I really need to pay attention to, or is it something that's more peripheral? But when you're new, everything's sort of flat in its importance. It's all equally important because it's all equally novel. So you're not able to judge, oh, this is something that's really core to the domain, and this is something that's kind of outside of the core of the domain. During the acclimation stage, and this is one interesting finding that's been borne out time and time again in empirical work, interest is state-like in the beginning of academic development, or situational is another word for state-like. And so what it means is that learners require an engaging context in order to support their academic motivation. Now, this is a little bit of a challenge because when learners are coming in, they don't know a lot. How do you engage them? It's hard to do too much autonomy support in a classroom when learners have low knowledge. So having that engaging instruction is so important during the acclimation stage. But if you are an acclimating learner, or if you remember being one, you might recall that your level of motivation in the domain would go up and down much more quickly. Having an engaging context or having a moment when you feel competent, you might feel incredibly motivated, but then your motivation might deflate rapidly in response to negative feedback, or perhaps to a non-engaging environment. Another thing during the acclimation stage is that surface level learning strategies. And these are the types of strategies that are used to manage information rather than create knowledge. For example, like note-taking. These are the kinds of strategies that drive performance in the domain. So if you're a new student in a domain, your capacity to be a student, really, note-taking and outlining strategies, reading strategies that could be useful across domains. These are the kinds of strategies that drive performance during the acclimation stage. And what's especially interesting to me about these types of strategies, because they don't require an immense amount of domain-specific knowledge, they relatively easily transfer across domains. So you could be a good note taker in biology class and a good note taker in, well, music class, because you're a good note taker. Whereas of course, I guess spoiler alert, as we become more expert, our procedural knowledge doesn't necessarily transfer across domains anymore because we start unlocking deeper and deeper processing procedures. But those processes require the declarative knowledge on which they're built. And so they don't transfer across domains very readily. So at this acclimation stage, we're still using mostly surface level learning strategies that are relatively easy to transfer. The middle stage of the MDL is called competence. In this stage, knowledge is growing, and it's also organizing around the core tenets of the domain. I kind of picture it, I don't know, like a structure being built in space, almost in a constructivist kind of metaphor. Not only is it getting bigger, but it's also becoming more efficient and more organized around what's actually the most useful reoccurring core aspects of the domain. What do you really have to know to be, say, an educational psychologist, or what do you really have to know to be a geneticist? What are the things that, well, we do sometimes know that, but they're more peripheral, they're not core. During the competence stage, and this is what I love seeing in my own graduate students, some of you guys are here, the importance of situational state-like interest is waning. So no longer are the competent students required, or no longer are they relying on this state-like situational interest. They become capable of mustering a more, I'm going to hit the next button here, a more stable trait-like individual interest in the domain. Almost an identification begins to develop, right? I am an educational psychologist. I am a geneticist. I am a musician. I am a neuroscientist. And because of that, they're able to face less than engaging environments. They're able to face failure and maintain their levels of motivation because their motivation is becoming more stable. And eventually, during this stage, that individual interest, that trait-like interest, eclipses situational interest in relevance. At the same time, surface-level study strategies are waning in importance, and deeper processing strategies that require that domain-specific knowledge are becoming more and more important. So I guess I've got educational psychology on the mind because it's the domain that I live in, but as you become a competent student in educational psychology, you begin to rely on your domain-specific strategies. For example, statistical or methodological strategies that we use in our domain, or interview techniques that we use when we talk to participants. These are the types of deeper processing strategies that don't transfer across domains very easily. Just because you learn it in ed psych doesn't mean you can go do it in somewhere else. And they're necessary to keep you moving toward expertise. I remember Pat always uses the metaphor of erosion, like the erosion of a canyon. It gets deeper and deeper as people learn, as the forces of the environment act on it, it becomes deeper. And I think that's a beautiful metaphor, maybe because I just really like canyons too. The final stage of the MDL is the expertise phase. At this stage, learners possess a rich and well-organized base of both declarative and procedure knowledge. So that not only do they have a lot of it, but they also are able to access very rapidly the ones that are the most important, and they might have strategically externalized, like rely on books or the, I don't know, papers that you might have to search the internet for the things that are less core in the domain. Experts have a deep and abiding individual interest that allows them. I still refer to experts as learners, by the way, because as an educational psychologist, everybody is a learner. And of course, if you don't learn as an expert, you pretty rapidly become no longer an expert. You have to keep learning. Otherwise, the domain moves past you. So you don't, just because you're an expert doesn't mean you stay an expert. But your deep and abiding individual interest, hopefully that trait-like interest, that trait-like motivation that you've developed, that identity with the field, it will allow you to persist through setbacks. And of course, persistence is going to be so important for creativity, because if you're doing something novel, failures and setbacks are absolutely inevitable. At this phase, both surface and deep processing strategies are able to be deployed. And of course, like I already said, experts have to keep learning. That's why I refer to experts as expert learners, because I don't mean to say that they're experts in learning. I mean to say that they're still learning because they have to learn to maintain their expertise. I know this is a lot to look at, but this is if you haven't been in the ed psych literature for too long, maybe you haven't run into this figure before. This is just a chart of what goes up and goes down in importance over the course of expertise development. Most people think, well, expertise, everything is going to go up, right? Well, of course, in the MDL, we argue that lots of things actually go down over the course of expertise development. For example, your reliance on state-like situational interest, that goes down, and your deployment of surface level study strategies also going to go down. Of course, most other things, domain knowledge, individual interest, deep processing strategies, these are all going to go up over the course of expertise development. So how do we add creativity? Well, I'll just go back before I give you the names. How do we add creativity in here? What goes up and what goes down vis-a-vis creativity as students go from acclimation, competence to expertise? How does it change? How does creativity start during acclimation? How does it change over the course? And during expertise, what does creativity look like? And so in keeping with the MDL, for example, the way that there's trait-like and state-like in interest, we posited two different forms of creativity that wax and wane in importance over the course of expertise development. We call them self and socially referenced creativity. So what we're arguing is that there's a form of creativity called self-referenced creativity. And it's essentially a situation where the novelty and task appropriateness of an idea is judged solely by the individual who creates it. There's really no reason to ask someone else what they think. What they think doesn't really matter because this is self-referenced creativity. And then socially referenced creativity. Oh, I forgot the second L in socially. Well, I'm so sorry for that. In socially referenced creativity, this is the type of creativity where the novelty and appropriateness is going to be judged by others, not me. So when I'm trying to create a new theory or a new study, oh man, my neighbors are beginning to weed whack. Can you guys still hear me, or should I bring this inside?
We don't hear it, Dennis, so you're good. Yep.
Thanks. Anyway, when I create a new theory or a new study, or when any of us in the field do, we have to think, what would others in the domain find novel? What would others in the domain find task appropriate? And so because we have the requisite domain knowledge, we're able to engage in that socially referenced creative process. So placing it in the MDL, we did like this. We said that in the acclimation stage, the lack of domain knowledge means that learners just don't yet know what others in the domain would view as creative. So they're necessarily going to rely on their own domain general experiences, their own lived experiences, their own self-referenced creativity. In the competence stage, the learner is starting to begin to predict what others in the domain would find original. And therefore, this capacity for socially referenced creativity is growing, and its importance in the learning process is also waxing. And of course, during the expertise stage, because experts' understanding of the domain norms is rich, we know what people typically do in our area, it allows us to break those norms in a way that would be judged by others as creative. Of course, caveat, if we can inhibit our automatic and fixed habits, because we know experts can sometimes fall into functional fixedness. Of course, if they fall into that pattern for too long, I might actually argue they are no longer experts because they're doing it the way that things have been done, but it's not the way that things are being done now. So the field possibly has moved beyond them. And so we created this figure. This is a figure about how self-referenced creativity starts out as very important during the acclimation phase, and then it goes down in importance over the course of learning. Socially referenced creativity starts out as very unimportant because it's essentially impossible. In a new domain, you don't know what people would find creative, and you develop it over the course of expertise development. And eventually it becomes the more important form. Of course, the importance of self-referenced creativity never quite goes away, because even as experts, we still want to be inspired. We still want to feel that rush of self-reference creativity is something we find new and surprising in order to keep ourselves excited. And I actually think focusing on self-reference creativity as an expert could be a way to avoid functional fixedness to a certain extent, although that would be another talk. We did posit some creative activities based on this theory for acclimation. We thought that during the acclimation phase, learners should focus on imaginative processes that require mainly declarative knowledge, because of course, learners usually develop declarative knowledge first. Procedural knowledge in a domain tends to come during the competence phase. So focusing on imaginative processes that require mostly declarative knowledge and are situationally motivating in order to keep those learners engaged because of their necessary reliance on state-like motivation. And of course, that can be supported by surface level strategies, right? Asking your first year psych students to do a creative structural equation model probably isn't going to work, because that would be a deep processing domain specific strategy that they just don't have yet. Ideas are creative at this stage if they are novel to the individual and useful in helping them learn. So what creativity means during acclimation is essentially self-reference creativity. So we have activities like divergent questioning, asking learners to come up with different types of questions within a domain, and specifically asking them to think of questions that others in the class wouldn't ask or that would surprise other people. Generating examples of something in a domain. We already do examples or instances tasks in a domain general context, but making them domain specific is a good way to help acclimating learners practice their creative skills within the domain. Perspective taking. Perspective taking has long been seen as a creative activity, but I think it's a particularly useful one for acclimating learners. If you ask them to take the perspective of somebody in the domain, perhaps the perspective of an expert, it can invite them to be creative in the domain that in a way that you might be surprised that you can get out of an acclimating learner. Now let's move to competence. In competence, we start to have access to procedural knowledge. And so we can make deeper and more domain-specific predictions and connections. So during this phase, I think what we could do with competent learners are things like domain-specific consequences tasks. What would happen if you were going to do this or that in your domain? Original uses of tools, kind of like a domain-specific alternate uses task. I've had fun in my classes asking learners to use data sets in new ways. This is an original use of a tool that other people haven't done. It's something surprising, something that you can push your competent students to think in a novel and original way. Analogical mapping. I've done a fair number of studies on analogical mapping, especially if you know my work. I think maybe some my work from when I was in grad school 10 years ago, but I did a ton of work on analogical mapping. This is commonly thought of as a creative process, but before competence, students really struggle with this. You have to have the requisite declarative knowledge in order to have access to the analogical procedures. Formulating hypotheses. I don't think that acclimating learners are essentially very capable of creating actual domain-specific testable hypotheses. In order to do this, you have to have enough richness to your knowledge, and I think it's better saved for the competence phase within the domain. In expertise, creativity becomes an effortful, risky, and time-consuming process that allows us to transform, expand, and redefine the domain. I think, hey, you want to just walk right through? Yeah, I'm in the middle of my talk. Yeah, it's okay. This is my partner walking through. Everybody say hi to her. So because experts have the necessary domain-specific knowledge and hold socially oriented goals, they can actually start doing this socially referenced creativity. I think some activities that can help with this, and I guess I hope it doesn't sound strange that I consider myself an expert in ed psych. Some of these things have helped me, I think, to push my work forward. Inhibiting automatic habits. That's a big one for experts. How do you stop yourself from doing things the same old way every single time? Problem finding. Problem finding is really hard for acclimating or competent learners. because they don't know enough about the domain yet in order to predict the problems that might arise. Trend forecasting, it's similar to problem finding, but it's more future oriented. Investing in original ideas. Maybe some of you have read the investment theory of creativity. I see this theory as being highly relevant, but specifically for experts. I just don't see acclimating or competent learners really investing in the same way. Identifying new collaborators. Collaboration is fundamentally part of the creative process, and in most domains, you really can't do it without a group. Persuading other experts. You've probably read arguments in the creativity literature that will posit creativity as being akin to persuasion. I think of this as like the social attributionist theory of creativity. Creativity as persuasion, as leadership, as having influence. So let's return. I know I moved a little quickly, but I'm looking at my watch and I want to make sure that I have time for questions. Because learners gain knowledge, individual interests, and deep processing strategies over the course of academic development, they're eventually going to become capable of socially referenced creativity. And I think that nudging learners along the way is really, really important. Teaching people, actually, I was just saying this in my lab meeting this week, write for the readers. Of course, when you become an expert, you also want to write for yourself so that you can feed your own intrinsic motivation. But when you're learning, when you're transitioning from acclimation to competence, or you're in competence and you want to move towards expertise, thinking about creativity as being more and more socially referenced. What do you think someone in your domain will find novel? So I think education should increase the socially referenced creativity of learners as they develop expertise. Not only do I think it should, like morally and ethically, but I would hypothesize that if we were to do a study, like a longitudinal study, we'd find self-referenced creativity going down and socially referenced creativity going up, which might be why some people think that schools kill creativity. Right? Of course, it should decrease the importance of self-referenced creativity. And for me, self-referenced creativity does always matter, but it's got to go down in importance for experts. Right? Of course, even though I'm focused on socially referenced creativity and ed psych, I still have my hobbies. I play guitar and I have other creative hobbies. And in those hobbies, I don't care what anybody thinks. It's just for me. But in my area of expertise, it's got to be socially referenced. This paper is published in the journal Educational Psychologist. It is a theoretical journal that is, I think, relatively well known in our field. I'd love for you to find it. This is the QR code, or I'm happy to send it to you. And I'm also working on another paper. This is just a little quick tidbit, but I'm working on this paper. Me and James Kaufman are doing it, and showing how the two dimensions of self-referenced creativity and socially referenced creativity imply the 4C model, where higher socially referenced creativity includes pro and big C, and lower socially referenced creativity implies mini and little. And higher self implies mini or big, whereas lower self implies little or pro. Anyway, you can read the 2x2. I'd love to chat about it. Let's talk. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Dennis. This was wonderful, and we've had a great chatter in the chat as well. A lot of collaborations happening. So now is the time that we are open to ask questions. Please feel free to put them in the chat, and Dennis and I'll take a look and let you know what comes through. But I'm going to be a little selfish and ask my own question first, if that's okay. I focus more on really young children, so looking basically birth to 5, and pretty much have been focused on 3 to 5. So I'm really curious, looking at the model, there's certain things within acclimation. You mentioned like perspective taking. Well, that's like role playing. When we're in the preschool room, we have kind of these things that are happening. But I'm just curious of your thoughts with such a young group of learners, making sure that we're kind of giving them the best tools or the best environments so that they can have this wonderful creative exploration in their life. Do those learners, those 3 to 5, do they have a place in this model, or do we need to think about them in a very different way, or in a way that is connected to the model that you talked about? Does that Does that question make sense?
I think they absolutely have a place in this model, Kelsey. I think their place is they're essentially in acclimation in everything at that
Right.
age, right? So that for those kids, it's really a self-referenced construct. Who does an idea have to be novel for? The 3-year-old, right?
Right.
I mean, I've gotten to spend some time with some 3-year-olds over the course of my life, and a lot of what they do is new to them, but
Yes.
not to you, right?
Yes. Yes.
But
But
that
it's new
doesn't
to them. It blows their mind.
that doesn't mean it's not creative.
Yeah.
Actually, this reminds me of a Seinfeld joke, where he said, you know, eventually I just got bored in life and I wanted to have a child because I wanted someone who was going to be impressed that I knew where to find the spoons. And I think that's a great way to talk about it, right? Kids, they don't know anything because they're so new to the world.
Right.
And so, I mean, they know things, but they know so much less. And
Right.
so what's novel is novel to them.
Right.
And so one thing I like about the model that I'm putting forward is that kids can be just as creative as adults. It's not
Yes.
that creativity is reserved for experts or creativity is reserved for innovation, paradigm shifting achievement. It's that creativity, really, there's just two different dimensions along which creativity can be measured or which it can be talked about. A 3-year-old can be just as creative as Isaac Newton or the Wright brothers or whoever. It's just that they're self-referenced creative.
Yeah. Yeah. That's such a good distinction.
Another point I would make, Kelsey, is that what counts as a domain changes over the course of development.
Mhm.
And this is a common ed psych conundrum that comes up. Like, let me give you an example. So in elementary school, reading is a domain,
Mhm.
but in university, reading is no longer a domain.
Right.
You see what I mean? So
Right.
you're expected to be able to read in any domain.
Right.
So if you're talking about university students, reading is typically discussed as a domain general skill.
Right.
If you're talking about elementary students, usually we talk about reading, like reading comprehension, as domain specific to the domain of
Right.
reading.
Right.
In elementary school, that's a domain, but it's not later. So
Right.
that's another potential complexity that I would just mention, because maybe we might be able to say that some of the things that very young kids are getting to try could be thought of as domains, like the domain of understanding nature, for example, like a child identifies a leaf or something. That maybe that is a domain at that age.
Right. Right.
You
Well, I'm
see what I
thinking like block play and how we play with objects. Are we able to understand our shapes? Are we understanding our numbers, our letters? These are all domain specific at that age.
Yeah,
Yeah.
whereas for university students, we don't usually consider block, like spatial blocking, like with blocks, to be
Right.
right. So
Right.
we would hope that that is fully developed.
Right. Right.
Anyway, I hope I'm making sense. I hope I'm able to help.
Yes, no, it's been a very interesting talk, and I really enjoy your perspective. We did have a question from Dr. Ruth in the chat. I want to make sure that I do ask it, but Dr. Ruth asked, who needs to be, sorry, I have it on my other screen, who needs to be socially referenced? Doesn't it make sense to work with young kids in general, not just experts, particularly in our milieu of fake news and the rest, to have both self and social strategies for critical as well as creative thinking across domains as well as within, to question the world as we find it. So who needs to be socially referenced? And should we work kind of along my questions too? Should we work with the young kids and adults as well, and not just experts?
I think if you're thinking about young kids, that question, it makes perfect sense to me, Ruth, that you would think that way. If I'm working with young kids, why does their creativity, if I'm going to start a child doing a finger painting exercise, why would I ever prime them with, now I need you to do something that other people would find surprising or new, right? That would be odd to do in early childhood. But when you think about learners with different types of domain specific goals, like for example, the goal to develop domain expertise, like for example, if you're working with a graduate student, you want to start them with the priming that eventually this, like for a dissertation, eventually this project should be novel in the field, not just to you. You see what I mean? So who needs to be socially referenced? People who want to be experts. Children don't need it. That's my point. But people who want to be experts, adults, we need it. It's kind of like saying what counts as creativity changes as we grow in development. As we become more expert, or rather, as we become older, we hope that we're developing some expertise, and then socially referenced creativity counts more because it allows us to, well, hey, it's crass, but make a living. It involves us to, it allows us to find a social niche, right? Being only self-referenced creative in your adulthood sort of is a little sad to me, actually. So I think adults need socially referenced creativity. Anyway, I hope I'm answering your question, Ruth. Thanks for your comment.
Yes. Okay. Do we have any other questions? I think Anna might have a question for you. Oh, there she is.
Oh, yes, only if there are no others to exhaust. Great. Yes, please raise your hand if you ask questions. Otherwise, I will keep popping in because we're going to use up the whole hour. Thank you so much, Dennis. That was.
Screen share on? I just got it. Saw the message.
No, you don't. It's closed.
Oh, perfect.
Your screen is not sharing, so don't worry.
Oh, great. Because I just saw, hey, will you please close the screen share? Sorry, I forgot that one. Okay.
Oh, yeah. We were able to do it from our side, so that's great.
Yeah.
I suppose my question, I have a couple of questions there. It's interesting to see a new model, and I think what's really useful about it is all the activities that you've coined out that are going to be really beneficial for each stage. So I thought that was really valuable. I want to push back against the idea that self-referentially creative stuff. I don't understand why it drops off, because kind of like, I feel like it should be on power even later. If the last thing you said is that you should do it because it's more of a practical reason to make it socially referenced so that you can earn income from it or become famous for it. But that's really, really applied. And maybe that's what comes from being an educational psychologist, but that's very, very applied, right? But I think the model would perhaps have a little more power, because I don't think yourself goes, it emanates, it first starts from you, what your ideas are. And then if you say the socially referenced things is important for, depending on the outcome you want, right? And so when you were talking, I was thinking of, I think it was Sternberg who proposed like the 8 different types of creative contributions. And I think if you're overly socially referenced, you are going to make a certain type of contribution that is permissible, that the people who you're talking to, your fields will be able to readily recognize that as a replication or this redefinition. He had these 8 little models. But if you're going to be proposing something that's really quite revolutionary or doing something right, then really your colleagues perhaps don't want you to be there. You might have to actually be, you might be saying something the way you're saying things that will have to change everyone's mind. So it's almost important to almost override your social reference points, because it can inhibit you. It can stop you from having creative confidence, creative courage, and so on. And so I think the emphasis on social referencing, if it's only based on it'll make your life easier and it'll make you famous, is a very different point to saying you should do it for your creativity because you will achieve bigger and greater things. And so I was wondering that, why does it have to drop? And are you only speaking about a certain kind of creativity in a specific kind of applied science? And B, does it apply at all in the arts, where you really, on the other side, have to be trusting your vision to push. And if you start to make it too socially referenced, in the words of Anthony Brandt, then it doesn't really make much sense if you're going to be very ambitious about having a kind of creative contribution that, is paradigm shifting, for instance.
I think I agree with you. I mean, domain differences would be really typical to predict. In I think essentially every ed psych effect is different across domains. So it would be probably clear that it's going to be different, for example, in the arts and sciences. One other point that maybe I didn't make, we tried to make it in the paper. I'd love to make it more as we go, but I don't think these dimensions are orthogonal. So as we develop both, or ideally as an expert, there should be a positive correlation between socially referenced creativity and self-referenced creativity. So because I'm involved in the field so closely, the things that excite me might also excite others. And if that's not true, then it's going to be more of a heavy reliance on things like persuasion and leadership in order to get other people to understand. And that's, I think, where you get into like the social attribution theories of creativity. Like if creativity is like in the social communication of the idea, then perhaps that might mean that self and socially referenced creativity are not as highly correlated in that domain. But for example, in like a high consensus field, they might be very highly correlated, but in a low consensus field, perhaps they're less. Or it might differ by creator. Maybe certain creators are just personally inspired by something that their field is not, and that's sort of unfortunate, but it could also just be the case. And that's, we get cases like creators that aren't recognized until much later.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just wondering because of the whole Thomas Kuhn idea as well. If you really are so socially referenced, then it's very hard to make real advances that are going to change anything. And so if you make creativity like, or push it, I think it's important to have some sense of social reference, obviously, and to really understand what other people are doing. And like you said, make a case in your papers and so on, write for the reader. All of that is absolutely, I think, is crucial. But to say that it's a metric that determines your creativity, I think is almost like, it means that paradigm shifting things are not necessarily going to happen because we're too eager or too willing to almost like throw out our, suspend our own judgment for the judgment of others. Get on the, it happens in the science. It explains, I think, what happens in the sciences. So I think your theory probably explains a lot why it's very hard for a science to change direction or to explore new ways of doing things, because it gets very fixated on things that work and convincing the people who are happy when it's slightly incremental to what they think is happening. But if it's going to mean that people have to revisit, rethink their assumptions, then it's not going to happen. And then it's much more likely for ideas to get shut out. So I think the theory has a lot of power to explain maybe how creativity, the sciences gets applied or and so on. But yeah, I'm sorry. Kelsey, I'll give it back to you. Thank you so much for answering.
Well, we have like one minute until 4 o'clock. Looking in the chat, I'm not seeing any additional questions, but just thank you, Dennis, so much for sharing your work with us and your passion with us. That's always such a pleasure. Thanks to everyone in the chat. I know there was a lot of great connections made, and if there's no further questions, which it doesn't look like it, I guess we will close this session. And thanks again so much, Dennis.
Yeah, happy to close it. Maybe I'll finish just by noting that for me, socially referenced creativity, and maybe this is my own way of thinking, but socially referenced creativity is not like it's not like conformist work. It's thinking about how I can intentionally change the way other experts think. Thinking about how I can make a contribution that is novel, that is potentially paradigm shifting. But I'm thinking about, what do other people know? So how do I teach them what I know in order to get them to change, if you see what I mean? It's a harder process because you have to bring people along with you. And I think that's one of the reasons why it doesn't happen as much maybe as it should. But I need to make sure as I write about it, that I'm clear that this is not about, like, it's not socially referenced just quality or feasibility or utility of the work. It's also socially referenced novelty too. Anyway. Yeah, thanks for listening to me. I really appreciate you guys.
Yes, thank you so much. And everyone have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, Kelsey.
Thanks.